What's going on, U.S. history kids? We back at it again with another video. Peep the new gear right here. See how I roll? Fresh, super classic design. We're coming to the end, man. We're getting close. 2 more units. We got to start this one today. This next unit where we're going is all about the Cold War. Okay. And we're going to cover a lot of information here. We're going to cover like 45 years of U.S. history and a few video lessons and over the next couple of weeks. So, just be ready. A lot of information coming at you. Okay, so just be ready. Today, we're going to talk about the beginnings of the Cold War. This is in the years that directly follow the end of World War II. I'll provide some context about what's going on, and we'll go from there, okay? So let's get into it today. So let's start off at the beginning, okay? At the end of World War II, there are two superpowers that are running the world. There's the United States, and then there's the Soviet Union. Now, the United States, democracy, capitalists, meaning, economic competition and freedom over everything. Americans at this point have a real big chip on their shoulder because we're seen as kind of the saviors of like World War II, right? We came in and saved the day. We want to share our American values and our capitalism with the world. We really think we're all that. The Soviet Union, similar, but they're totalitarian and communist, right? Powerful, all-powerful leader, economically speaking, because of communism, everything is really split up. It's supposed to be split up evenly. The government controls pretty much all types of businesses. So there really aren't private businesses and such. The Soviet Union thinks their way of life is superior to the US, and they want to kind of, share their values and the communism with the world. So inevitably, these two superpowers are going to collide, and they're going to compete to be the sole superpower. And they're going to compete indirectly in wars, in Olympics, in trying to get to the moon and in the space race, pretty much in having the biggest atomic weapons. I mean, we're going to talk about all of this kind of going forward. So these two sides are really going to compete, and it gets escalated as time goes on, and we'll cover all these events. I want you to take a look at this map. This is the map of Europe post World War II. So some new countries have formed, like Yugoslavia. You see borders have changed. You notice this kind of black, almost maroon colored line. That's what's going to separate, okay, the Eastern European and the Soviet Union influenced countries with the U.S. Western Europe influenced countries, right? Notice particularly Germany. Again, it's split in two. This is important to remember, okay? So there's a free Western Germany, and then there's Eastern Germany. There's also Berlin, which is split, right? Remember, Berlin is split in two, okay? As time goes on, these countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, etc., are going to have less and less freedom and control, and they're going to be more controlled by the Soviet Union. And then these countries are going to be kind of pushing against the Soviet Union, especially with the United States support. And we're going to talk about that. This is another picture. It does a little bit clearer job. So you see countries in gold, kind of European NATO countries. So they're going to side with the United States. The communist bloc countries in green. And then there's neutral countries that are kind of near the borderline, or just generally speaking are neutral in these events. And then that red line is referred to as the Iron Curtain. We'll talk about that in a second. The Iron Curtain, this is just a term that was used, first described by Winston Churchill, that talked about the U.S.S.R, the Soviet Union, influence over the Eastern Bloc countries. Essentially, once you got past West Germany, Austria, and so on and so forth, you really didn't know much about what was happening in the Soviet Union. It was hard to get in. The Soviet Union was very secretive. They didn't really allow a lot of their people to travel and move freely. So moving to trying to know what's going on in these countries, you had no idea because there was an iron curtain, right? A normal curtain, it'll open up, you can kind of see through and you can walk through it in a way. But an iron curtain, you can't move it. It's powerful and you can't see or really hear. And that's kind of what this part of the world, Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, is kind of, that's what's going on. Very powerful, all controlling, kind of unknowing of what's going on. So some years go by, and a few different events happen that begin to escalate the Cold War. The first one was like the Truman Doctrine. It was in 1949, so about 4 years after the end of World War II. This was an American foreign policy started by Harry Truman, and it was created to prevent Soviet and communist expansion. There was a fear, and we'll talk about this a little bit, of communism spreading and taking over the world. Wasn't good for American business, wasn't in the best interest at the time for the American people, and there was a general fear that the Soviet Union was going to influence and try and take over other countries around the world. It led to the creation of NATO, and most historians often cite this as kind of the beginning of the Cold War, at least determining the sides. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So it's pretty much all these countries. So most of this Cold War, although it does take place kind of across the world, it's very Eurocentric and American-centric. So you'll hear me use terms like the Western nations, the Western world. That means kind of Western Europe and then like Canada and the United States, whereas the Eastern European or the Soviet Union influence is over here, okay? So the Soviet Union, they look at NATO, they're not too cool with that. They kind of formed their own alliance called the Warsaw Pact of the countries that are technically independent, but really the Soviet Union kind of has control over them and influence over them. So these are like the Eastern European countries. And so now you have kind of like two sides. So again, the world is slowly moving towards more and more and more of conflict. So countries in blue, they're going to represent NATO. Countries in red, they're going to represent the Warsaw Pact. Countries in blue, allied with the United States. Countries in red, either by choice or not, allied with the Soviet Union, right? And you notice there's a tiny speck of blue here in Eastern Germany. That is the free part of Berlin. Remember, after World War II, Berlin is split up, okay? More pictures. Just to make sure you understand, right? There's two sides. Other events that happen, okay? Marshall Plan, this is a big one. After World War II, Europe was in disarray, very similar to World War I, even worse. So Europe had to be rebuilt. And the US gave a lot of money, $20 billion back then, which is a lot of money today, to help rebuild it. Now, if you notice here, the only countries that got money were the countries that were US quasi-allies. Turkey, Greece, Italy, Western Germany, France, the United Kingdom. They got money to help rebuild. Notice, Soviet Union didn't get money. These Eastern Bloc, Eastern European countries didn't get money, even though they had to rebuild as well, right? But the United States wasn't going to do that. They weren't going to give money to what they saw as their enemy to help rebuild, right? So again, fanning the flames here, kind of conflict. A reminder again, Germany, Berlin are split up. Remember that. So after kind of the Marshall Plan, and this was kind of the beginning of us trying to pull out of Europe and kind of leave, we eventually get to this event known as the Berlin Blockade, which is the first major crisis of the Cold War. This happens in 1948, 1949. So the NATO countries tried to kind of introduce this new form of currency for Germany. And they did it in Western Germany and in West Berlin. And basically the plan was to allow Germany to hopefully reunify and try and rebuild and form a new country, right, after a couple of years of occupation. The Soviet Union was not down for this. The Soviet Union was like, no, this is ours now. This is Eastern Germany is ours, right? And so this is the problem. Western Berlin is surrounded by Eastern Germany. So they're kind of trapped. They're a free part of, they're allied with the United States, supported by the United States, but they're trapped. And because they're trapped, the Soviet Union knows this. They block railway and roads and bridges to get into Berlin. It's a blockade because they want to have influence over Berlin. And this is a problematic because that Western Berlin was promised the other allies, the United States and such, to be the free part of Berlin, right? It was promised to us. This is our territory. So now we got to have to get into this weird, awkward position. Like, what are you going to do, man? Are you going to allow us to give these people what we need and what we want to give them? So it was very tense. Eventually, we had to actually do airlifts, the NATO countries, to help the people of Berlin. Russia, the Soviet Union, they cared very little about these people of Berlin. Because again, you got to remember, the Battle of Berlin was intense. Nazi Germany tried to oust the communists, would kill communists, right? There was the Soviet Union, the Russians, they looked at the Germans as an enemy still, traitors, perpetrators of the Holocaust, right? And so there was a lot of bad blood. So the Soviet Union, Russia, they cared very little about Berlin. They didn't really care that, people were going to be starving and sick, right? So we had to do a lot of these airlifts to really help out these individuals, to give them food, clothing, medicine, etc. The airlifts were risky and dangerous because you didn't want to seem like you were invading or trying to launch an attack. And so it was very tense, right? Because we had just gotten out of a war. Was this going to lead us to the next war between the Soviet Union and the NATO countries, right? So you kind of just saw, flying in from all these different airports from across Western Germany into Berlin. A lot of supplies, right? Their planes all lined up. Food, clothing. Okay. And so this was a big result. Ultimately, the blockade ends, and the Soviet Union decides, okay, we'll let that part of Berlin be. And again, this is trying to avoid full-scale battles and wars. Okay. So this is like the first major event that happens. Now, while all this is going on back on the home front of the United States, there is now a general fear of communism and a general dislike and a fear of the Soviet Union that is now starting to plague and play in the minds of Americans at home. This leads us to a interesting time period in U.S. history referred to as McCarthyism. And this takes place in the years following World War II into the 50s. So it originated with President Truman. He gave an executive order. It required that all federal employees, right, they had to be screened for loyalty, right? There was a fear that, are you a communist? Are you going to be a spy? Are you going to be a traitor and give the Soviet Union information? It was this really hysteria that it gripped the nation. A Republican senator named Joe McCarthy stated infamously that he had a list of hundreds of government employees and other individuals who were undercover spies for the Soviet Union, and he was going to expose them. So he would go on to interview many celebrities, athletes, politicians, all accused of being communist spies. This period of time led to a lot of people were interested because it was high profile names like big celebrities and athletes. It was a hot button issue because there was already this distrust of communism in the Soviet Union. It only exacerbated and made that worse. That's Joe McCarthy right there. This will be your homework assignment, so you read a little bit more about him and this later. These are some of the people that were considered to be communists at one point, right? And on this list, which turned out none of these people really were spies, or, they might have had an interaction with someone who said they were a communist or attended a party one time 20 years ago, and Joe McCarthy was trying to sweep all these people up. In general, McCarthyism is a fraud. Most accusations against people were false, right? It was really just mass hysteria, and no one wanted to be blacklisted or seen as a communist. So while McCarthyism failed in its goal to find communist spies, it succeeded in really the alternative goal which was to turning a public opinion to be more anti-communist in general and anti-Soviet Union and generally more conservative. Because a lot of the people that were targeted, you know, were people that were seen as kind of threats to the American values, artists, scientists, celebrities, right? People that are like, oh, they're, you know, corrupting the youth and stuff, you know? And McCarthyism was supported in secret by the highest level of government, the FBI, all the big agencies, right? Because this was kind of a form of propaganda, and especially by the Republican Party, because again, would drive people to slowly kind of become more and more conservative, which is good for the Republican Party because then those people who, if they're more conservative, more likely to vote for Republicans, right? And this has existed today. This is a lot of the roots of the hate against China and other places are rooted kind of in the fear of communism, right? We've talked a little bit about that, but now it's becoming more real as we get close. There's a fear of communism, and generation upon generation was raised with that fear. You guys might have read the book called The Crucible. It's inspired by McCarthyism. The whole book's about like the Salem witch trials and everyone like, you're a witch, right? But none of it was really true. It was just mass hysteria. Very similar. Ironically, the author of that book was accused of being a communist. Surprise, surprise. He kind of wrote a book about how McCarthyism was dumb, right? And of course, he was going to be targeted all of a sudden. Not surprising. And that's it. That's where we're going to stop today. Okay. We'll pick it up next time with the Korean War and talking about the 50s. Make sure you watch this video. I'll talk to you guys later. Have a good one.